here. So I would like to preface this video by saying that I have only seen up to the end of season 3 of Poldark, so anything that happens in season 4, not talking about it, not including it in any way. So Poldark is a frustrating show to me for so many reasons, but the main reason I find is the character of George Warleggan. Specifically in the way that it frames him and his relationship towards class. Class is generally a very important theme in Poldark, yet I find that it refuses to discuss it in any kind of meaningful or nuanced way, and rather just uses it as a reason why Ross is perfect. Now, George is a character that they could really utilise if they wanted to have a meaningful discussion about class. His grandfather was a blacksmith, his family rose to prominence in 2 generations, and yet he's constantly ostracised by high society, by the aristocracy. The show makes this clear. It doesn't shy away from the fact that he's shunned by high society. He faces classism, but the show implicitly judges him for it. In the scene where George told Aunt Agatha about how Ross and Francis and the other children bullied him in school because his grandfather was a blacksmith, Aunt Agatha shakes her head and says, "Oh no, George, this is what you never understood. They bullied you because you tried so pitifully to deny your grandfather, not because he was a blacksmith," which I think really epitomises the way in which Poldark misunderstands both class issues and, by extension, George. It's being presented as if Aunt Agatha and young Ross, the bully, were in the right. Sure, maybe that was Ross's reason for bullying. Aunt Agatha isn't lying here, but that doesn't mean it's right or that it's not classist. It's just as classist. And besides, George would have only been so desperate to deny his ancestry if he'd already faced class-based discrimination. You know, you're not going to be ashamed of your working class background if you haven't been discriminated against. So again, it's still really classist, and I find it hard to believe that the discrimination George obviously had previously faced didn't also come from his classmates, you know? The narrative is pushing this idea that people, even if they're children, as George was at this time, somehow deserve to be discriminated against if they don't fight back or they don't act as courageously as maybe they should. Instead of sticking up for himself, George became more desperate to fit in with his bullies, and while that's not maybe the bravest reaction, it's a very, very understandable one, and especially when it's, again, coming from a child, you know? In pushing this weird narrative that a person is bad for not sticking up for themselves, they're also pushing the blame onto victims of oppression instead of criticising the systems of oppression that permeated 18th century society. Now look, George himself is obviously a very deeply classist man. I'm not going to deny that, it shouldn't be denied, and in fact it should be condemned, which the show does. But in condemning him, it completely ignores the motivation for his actions. Now again, not to say that the motivation is any kind of excuse, but it's something that we need to take into account if we want to have any kind of class discussion. The classism that George exhibits is a result of him trying to escape the oppression that he himself has faced. His greatest desire in life is to be accepted by the upper class, and it drives his every action, even his obsessive hostility towards Ross. That, I'm convinced at least, is entirely down to class reasons, even if, you know, George wouldn't necessarily see it that way himself. So George distances himself from the lower classes in an attempt to, you know, make people forget his ancestry, make the higher classes think that he's one of them. He tries to align himself with the upper classes in any way possible, and one of those ways is through distancing himself from working class people by means of exploiting and oppressing them. His actions here can be condemned while acknowledging why he is the way he is, and without judging him for facing oppression himself, or for how that oppression and discrimination has affected him personally. Not only can the show frame George with nuance and care and understanding, I would argue that they have a responsibility to. Poldark is so intent on making George the villain, especially in season 3, that they put a negative spin on every single thing he does, which, in my opinion, has the result of coming across as classist in narrative. By ignoring how classism has affected George, and in some cases acknowledging it only to blame himself for facing that classism, the show ignores the way the toxic class system works, how it forces the working class to either be oppressed or be the oppressors. This 18th century system doesn't really allow any middle ground for people in George's position. I say that it forces people to choose between being the oppressed and the oppressors. That's not even entirely true. It appears to give them that choice. I mean, as we can see from George's own climb up the social ladder, though he now has the wealth to exploit the poor in his own vain attempt to distance himself from them, he will still always be viewed by the gentry and aristocracy as lesser than them because he was not born into the privilege that they were. You know, Ross himself, who at least in terms of class is presented as the moral compass of the show, calls George an upstart in a moment of anger against him. And this is never addressed. This is not, you know, a plot point where Ross has to confront his own classism. This is Ross's own opinion, and because it's never addressed, and George is doing something bad in this situation, it's the show's opinion. Ross doesn't accept him, partly because of his class, and neither does the show. And, you know, as much as you can hammer on about what a bad person George is, and he is a bad person, he has good points, but I think, you know, the stuff he does is very, very bad. At least part of the reason the show sees him as a villain and wants you to see him as a villain is because of his class. In presenting George as being deserving of being shunned by the upper class because of his bad actions, and this is ignoring the fact that discrimination is never a valid punishment for moral failings, because by definition discrimination is against something that's inherent to you, where moral failings are never inherent to a person. The show fails to criticise the rigid class system and the lack of social mobility available to people from a working class background. It doesn't acknowledge the fact that in order for a working class character like George, he's not working class, but he comes from a working class background. In order for a character like him to rise in rank at all, he has to either accept total social isolation or do everything in his power to be accepted by the gentry and the aristocracy. Instead of continuing its admittedly very, very shallow criticism of the 18th century class system and the lack of social mobility it allows, it instead chooses just to criticise George as a person. It completely swerves away from any class discussion it could have by ignoring the effects of class on George and instead just saying, oh well, he's a bad person, that's why all of this is happening. He's being shunned just because he's bad. This is a valid punishment for him as a character, when clearly it's not, because he's not being punished for his actions here. In that scene where George, I think it's season 3 episode 5, where George goes to a party with held by Lord Falmouth, I think, he is shunned by everybody there well before he says anything rude or offensive, and of course he's shunned after he says those things, but the point is, he is not being shunned for saying those things, he is being shunned because they view him as inherently lesser. And the show wants you to think, oh well, you know, George deserves this ostracization because, well, just look at him, he's the worst. Which is so shallow and insensitive. Really, the show's treatment of George really comes across as just against social mobility in any way. It seems almost in favour of the oppressive class system that it pretends to criticise. It presents this view that the poor should stay poor and not have any ambition, especially when the other main character in the show who is considerably risen in rank is Demelza, who made no real attempt to get with Ross or to rise out of her poverty. In this way, she's almost a foil for George. In her rise to the gentry, Ross made the first move. Ross suggested marriage, and in fact, when they first slept together, she tried to quit her job and go away because she'd overstepped the mark. And once they're married, she spends a long time still thinking of herself as a kitchen maid and less than others. She has a very hard time adjusting. Now, none of this is meant to insult Demelza or imply that she's a passive character, because I really don't think that's true. I love Demelza, but in terms of the theme of class, and when looked at in conjunction with George's character, she comes across very much as the grateful peasant trope, at least for the first season. Her elevation in rank was not of her own initiative, whereas George's was. We see George manoeuvre to be accepted by the upper class, and that manoeuvring is always presented as wrong, without fail, because it relies on the exploitation of others. This presentation of it being wrong is not inherently bad because, of course, exploiting other people is wrong. That's just a fact. But with no exploration of a system that forces this kind of exploitation, and with no character whose situation mirrors George's own that doesn't advance through exploitation, who finds a better way, then the only logical conclusion to draw from the narrative they're giving us is that to have any kind of ambition to move upwards in the world is bad and wrong, and that peasants should stay peasants and be grateful for what they're given. And if they happen to be just chosen by a rich person to be elevated, then they must forever be grateful to them. Then that's fine and good, but if they do anything of their own initiative, that's bad because they're presumptuous peasants. You know? It's a really kind of conservative viewpoint to take, and it's just ironic to me because it's the same viewpoint that in words the show seems to denounce, but implicitly is one that they kind of really go for. You know, the message sent is ultimately one that scorns George's ambitions and his background, and the very concept of social mobility. Now, Ross, on the other hand, is presented as the moral opposite to George in the way that he treats the working classes. Where George exploits the poor, Ross treats them fairly. He's kind to them, you know, he pays them a good wage, etc. But the show refuses to acknowledge Ross's class privilege. He was born into power, he was born into privilege, and because of this he will always be accepted by the gentry and the aristocracy. Sometimes he embraces his privilege and he enjoys the benefits of his class, and other times he will scorn society and judge anyone who participates, especially George, without realising that George can't afford to shun society in the way that Ross does, because George is not inherently accepted by that society, and the show won't acknowledge it either. George must participate in society. His only options are to just accept poverty, or to forever seek the approval of the upper classes. Oh, interestingly, and when I say interestingly, I mean classistly, if that's a word, by where I'm up to near the end of season 3, he is so far the only character who is actually shown to have exploited the poor and to actively oppress the poor. The show pays lip service to the fact that, you know, the higher class, the ruling class, oppresses the working class. The show does pay lip service to this idea, so clearly it's what they consciously want us to believe, but characters like Caroline Penvennon, her uncle Ray, etc., the main aristocratic characters of the show, and later on I think Lord Falmouth, if I if I am hearing correctly, because I haven't watched that far. But all of those characters have expressed, a couple of right-wing ideas, but ultimately they're shown to be morally good characters who very quickly, change their tune and go along with Ross. Which, when the only character who oppresses the poor is the social climber, as opposed to the good, righteous aristocrats, it's a bit suspicious, It once again conveniently ignores underlying class structures to vilify the social climber. So, in conclusion, in the show's attempts to affirm his status as an unredeemable villain, it presents his victimization by the ruling classes as a just punishment for his own treatment of those lower in rank, ignoring the fact that George was a victim long before he was ever an oppressor. It follows this really shallow idea that a person can either be a victim or a perpetrator, that they cannot be both, and thus that we cannot feel sympathy and condemn someone at the same time. Despite the fact that George's complex relationship with class is present in the show, it's all there, all of his actions are framed in a wholly negative light. The show makes him the ultimate oppressor, thus exonerating the true ruling class of their oppressive behaviour, and ignoring the wider systematic oppression of the 18th century class system. Through its shallow discussion of class, Poldark takes a very, very interesting character that they really could utilise here and tries to reduce someone who canonically isn't a one-dimensional villain into a one-dimensional villain, and it has the effect of really making his character quite frustrating, but also giving the show very classist undertones. And so that is how Poldark has failed George Warleggan. Thank you for watching.